Welcome. In the last two demonstration, we saw how to draw a bark up close. So essentially, we saw how to create this kind of bark or the trunk with ridges, and then we also saw how to create a deeply fissured or grooved bark, something like this. So essentially, what I will do in this demonstration is to show yet another way to draw a bark up close. And I really like drawing bark. So like I've said, a bark is an ideal thing to draw with the pen and ink because essentially they have the texture that you can capture, using pen and ink. And I really like doing it. So what I will do is to show you yet another way in which you can draw the bark up close. The thing to keep in mind is that, when we are drawing different types of bark, what we are essentially doing is to focus on different aspect of a bark. So essentially, there are different characteristics of a bark, right? And what you need to do is to essentially, bring out that characteristic to capture the essence of the bark. So for example, when we drew something like this, we focused on creating these crevices, these grooves, something like, using this stroke. So we focused on, essentially, capturing the crevices of the bark, and then we got the result of a deeply fissured grooved bark. So essentially that's what we did. We focused on these crevices, and when we drew this drawing, we focused on creating these kind of ridges. So essentially, we focus on creating the ridges on the trunk, and we focus on that. So what happens is that with what you essentially focus on define the look, the feel of your the bark overall. So here we have a very ridged bark, here we have a deeply fissured bark. So depending on what you're focusing on, that's the feel your bark acquires. And what we will do in this demonstration is to focus on another aspect of bark, which is to show the different pieces of bark, essentially, right? We will draw the individual pieces of bark and then we will texture them. So what I've shown in other demonstration is that when you have a bark up close, the one way that you can do show the detail of a bark is to essentially draw these kind of pieces of bark, right? Something like this we saw in other demonstrations, that you can draw individual pieces like this and then essentially shade them. So that's the kind of approach that we will use in this demonstration, is to show that those pieces of bark and then texture them. So essentially what we do is we start by essentially just laying down the different pieces of bark. So essentially many times when in a trunk you will see those bark comprised of these individual pieces, essentially, right? And so that's what we will capture. So that's what we will focus on in this demonstration. And what I'm doing is to essentially use this kind of wiggly kind of line to essentially define the edges of a bark. So again, the thing is that as you come closer, you want to show more detail, and from close up, the bark is always very jagged. The edges of a bark piece is always very jagged. So that's what we have to capture over here. So that's what I will do. I just simply use this kind of jagged line to essentially define and capture these individual bark pieces. So that's what I will do. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the bark pieces are the biggest in the center, and then they reduce towards the edges. So that's what I will do as well. So I'll start by laying down these small pieces towards the edges, something like this, and then towards the center I define a bigger piece. So essentially what we are doing in this approach is to focus on these individual pieces of bark, and essentially we will texture them and bring out that nice feel of bark details up close. So what I'm doing right now, as you can see, is essentially just creating these pieces. And the way to do it is to essentially use a shape like this. Essentially just let your pen wander and just do something like this, essentially. So do not use something like this, that just kills the effect of the bark. So you'll always have some kind of jagged edges to the bark, and also kind of change the size so that you have these bark pieces that are smaller towards the edges, and then make them bigger towards the center. And again, have a nice overlap. So essentially, do not make them all in a row, right? So what I'm doing is to have a nice overlap. So, I just stop over here, and then I start another bark over here, and something like this. So this is real fun thing. This is something that you can play around with, and you can, over here, I'm using elongated shapes. But if you want, you can even use a bit of more of a shape like this, which is a bit more circular. So always keep your edges jagged. So that's the most important thing, is to keep the edges jagged. But after that, then you can have even more elongated pieces. So if you want, you can have, smaller pieces, something, like this, for example, right? Or you can have, this smaller rounded pieces. So essentially you can use different shapes, you can play around with different shapes. But that's the essence in this approach. So essentially in this approach, we are creating, defining these individual bark pieces, and then we will texture them to have a nice feel for bark up close. And here again, use bigger piece in the center, and again just let your pen wander, right? So essentially do not kind of make them in any particular order, but the two key things is to have the jagged edges and make the size smaller towards the edges, and make it bigger in the center, and yeah, just have fun doing it, right? And then you can always experiment with different shapes, different sizes, and you can even experiment with different texturing of these pieces. So essentially we will texture them in a moment, but yeah, so there's the other element that you can play around with to have a different feel for the bark. So there we have it, right? So this is how you can have yet another way to essentially draw a bark up close and have a nice feel for it. So like I've said, drawing a bark up close is really fun to do. It's something simple, and what I wanted to show is in my last few demonstrations is how different approaches can be used to create a different feel for bark. So that's what what we are doing over here. So now we have a nice a breakout of and I can just add one more over here, something like this. Something like this. So essentially what we did was to kind of define this kind of bark outlines over here, and now what we will do is essentially shade them, texture them, so that we have a nice feel for kind of a bark up close. And the way you texture them, there are again different possibilities. So one option is to simply use these kind of parallel lines to essentially shade these pieces individually. So essentially, we will shade them individually. So in some demonstrations, when we draw a small trunk like this, we just do the trunk, like this. We shade it all across the trunk. But we are doing a bark up close, and here, once we draw these small pieces, what we do next is to essentially shade these pieces individually. And what we will do essentially is to use these kind of marks and dots essentially to shade these pieces. So I'll start by putting these marks and dots, something like this over here. And as you can see, these marks and dots are great at kind of just indicating some kind of rough texture. So just move your pen a little bit, take mark here, a mark over there, something like this. So this is a great way to just create a kind of texture for your bark. You can even use a mix of dot, a small tick, something like this. So this is something very organic, something you just move your pen and just leave a bit of dot here, a bit of dot there, so something like this. So this gives a great appearance of kind of a kind of bark texture. And the other important thing to keep in mind is to always make the one end of this bark piece darker than the other. So this is how you bring out the form. So for example, here I will go ahead and add a bit more dots and ticks to one end to make this darker. So as you can see, this darker and this lighter end gives it a nice feel for the form of the bark. So we don't want our barks to appear flat. So for example, let me start by this other piece over here. So I add a bit of dots and ticks over here and something like this. So right now, this has a uniform tone across it, and it's not really appearing very kind of curved, or it doesn't have a bit of form. So what I will do in the next step is to essentially add a bit more ticks and marks towards the one side. So what happens is that when you make one edge darker, then it brings out the form. So essentially, in anything that is rounded, anything that has a form, it needs to have lighter and darker tone, because the light will not form uniformly on it. So anything that is a bit curved, it will have that kind of light and darker areas, and that's what we want to capture for this each bark piece individually in this approach. Really, bring out the form of each bark piece. So again, over here, I have a uniform tone, and what also happens is that the uniform tone also kind of mixes to different bark pieces. So essentially, here we cannot make out the distinction between this bark piece and this bark piece. So what happens is, once you add a bit of dark to one edge, it serves two purposes. It helps to bring out the kind of curvature, the form of that bark piece. It also helps to define the distinction between the different bark pieces. So now I added a bit of dark over here, and as you can see, this dark and the light is now giving a bit more form to this bark piece, and this darkness is also helping to differentiate between this piece and this piece. So essentially, there's a transition from dark to light to dark to light across the bark pieces, and that helps to kind of give a nice form and also a bit of distinction to different bark pieces. So that's the main technique in this approach, is that you essentially start by drawing this bark piece outline, and then use this marks and ticks to essentially kind of texture each bark piece individually. And the other thing is that once you have a layer of ticks and marks, then go ahead and darken one end, something like this, and then it will bring out the form even more and essentially give a nice feel to your bark piece. So now each bark piece is looking as if it has its own form, and that is really important thing to do, because essentially what you want in up close detailed drawing like this is to give as much detail, as much texture as you can. And so again, over here, this is looking a bit flat, and I again go ahead and just again never use anything like this. Essentially, you do not want to give it a hard darkness. So this is kind of hard darkness, but what we want is to essentially use the same strokes, but essentially just use the ticks and something like this to add more darkness. So this is the kind of when you add make it darker using the same ticks and crosses over here, it retains that feel for the bark. So that's what we want. So that's what I will do for the rest of the bark pieces as well. Simply go ahead and use my ticks and dots a little bit over here to have initial texture, and then I go ahead and use more of it in one end to create that kind of form. So this is how it is. So essentially, like I said before, you essentially focus on different aspects of a bark to find its texture. So here, what we are doing is to focus on those bark pieces and kind of defining a bark that is comprised of these different pieces, and that is the effect that we will get in the end. So there are a lot of different, every bark has its own characteristics. So some barks, they are deeply fissured, and that is the most prominent thing to kind of bring out in your texture. Some barks, they have these kind of individual pieces, big pieces that kind of together comprise the main feel for that bark, and that's what we are doing over here. And in some other cases, you will have a bark that has a very kind of distinct spots, for example, right? So birch tree, that has a nice kind of spot. So essentially then you can focus on capturing those kind of spots as well. So essentially, always study the bark, in your surrounding. If you happen to come across a tree, and see, what is the main element, main characteristic of that bark that catches your attention, and then what you can do is to try to capture that in your drawing, essentially. So so the thing is, you cannot be trying to capture too many different aspects of a bark, because that will in the end kind of sometimes it works, but mostly it creates a bit a bit confusing aspects. It's always good to essentially, when you're drawing when you're doing a drawing of this size, so essentially this is something like 3 by 4 inch or something like that. So in this size, you do not want to kind of have too much kind of detail, because that sometimes kind of sometimes it works out well, but mostly in smaller drawings, it's always good to focus on one specific aspect of a bark. So essentially what I'm doing in my different demonstrations to show how you can you focus on different aspects of a bark, and essentially kind of highlight this, and then essentially end with a nice simple drawing. So essentially in this drawing, what we're doing is essentially create these individual bark pieces, and creating a nice detail for the bark is comprised of these pieces. So that's what I'm doing essentially. Once I draw my bark outline, I simply go ahead and use this ticks and dots to essentially shade it, something like this. And again, you can see that in the edges we have the small pieces, and that is kind of giving us a bit more sense of roundness for the trunk, because what happens is that with the small pieces, you get a bit more density of darkness, so that makes it a bit darker, and that's what we want, right? So we want a bit of difference in tone across the trunk that we have seen in other demonstrations. And here, by making these pieces small and using the dots, what happens is that you acquire a bit more darkness in the edges, and that gives a overall feel for the roundness of the trunk as well. There we have it. So something, I'll go ahead and just quickly add a bit more over here, and then quickly again add a bit more over here. So this is how it is. The drawing bark is really fun, because there are so many different ways in which you can do it, and there's so many different techniques and approaches within the same overall technique. So for example, like I said, in this technique, we're essentially creating these bark pieces, right? So again, you can use these different shapes. We can make them more elongated, or you can make them even bigger, and things like that, right? So and then, like I said, here we have used the sticks and marks, but the other option is to essentially shade them using these kind of parallel lines. So use the parallel lines, and then you darken them in one end, something like this. So you can use this approach as well to create this kind of texture for the bark pieces. So again, there are a lot of different options, and again, in terms of using the sticks and marks, you can again use them in different ways, right? So if you want, you can even add a bit of dots and something like this to the bark pieces. So again, experiment with using different strokes, different ways to create the texture for these bark pieces. But essentially the simplest is just use the sticks and dots and something like this, right, to just simply create a kind of so this is great at depicting some kind of roughness to the edges of the bark, something like this. But again, you can always experiment with different strokes, and if you want, you can add even a bit more crevices. So like we have seen, if you want to add a crevices, you can again go ahead and actually add explicit crevice like this over here somewhere as well. So you can always combine the different things that we have seen in last few demonstrations in creating a bark, and even create more interesting bark textures. So there we have it. So this is how you can essentially use this technique to essentially give a different feel for a bark. So essentially here we have a feel for a bark that is comprised of this different bark pieces that kind of comprise that bark feel. So again, so when you compare this with this approach, here we focused on these crevices, right? So these deep grooves. So this has a different feel for a bark. So essentially this is the real fun thing about the drawing a bark, is that you can just focus on a particular aspect, and use different textures to have a real different feel. And I really like drawing the bark, because essentially the deep texture of a bark is really ideally suited for drawing with pen and ink. And this is a very simple drawing. Just drawing a bark up close is a real simple fun drawing that we have seen in last few demonstrations to do. And what I really want to do is to show you different ways in which you can do it, and this should get you started in doing your own experiment in creating different bark textures. But the best is to always study the nature. So essentially, if you come across a tree and you find the bark interesting, try to study and see what is the main aspect of that bark that catches your attention, and then you can try to replicate that in your drawing. So that's real fun. fun. So essentially, whenever you're outside, always study your surroundings, always study the way that the bark is structured, or the way the trees are grouped together, and then always try to replicate that in your drawing. So there we have it. So this is how essentially you can create this is yet another way to create the bark texture up close. And what I will do essentially is to again just ground the trunk. Over here I'll just use a bit of grass, something like this, to ground the trunk, and then draw a kind of we can draw a bit of mountain in the backdrop or something like this. So essentially I won't cover the background, but yeah, there are a lot of other possibilities. So you can even draw other trees over here and things like that. But yeah, drawing a bark up close, a tree trunk up close is real fun. I mean, I just really like doing it because, capturing the bark texture. So essentially bark texture and old barns, I would say these are the two main elements, that are ideally suited for pen and ink, because they have that kind of, that texture that is, something that you can really capture by using, your pen. So some elements are, easier to draw in pen and ink than others. So for example, face is quite difficult to do in pen and ink. Essentially the face where you want to show the smoothness of the face, because the pen line, by its nature is kind of, demarcating a line as such, right? So some elements are difficult, right? So human face, and the smoothness of a human face, or the face of a young lady or a small child, is a bit difficult, essentially, if you're trying to capture the smoothness. But whereas bark has all those those crevices, those textures that are ideally suited for pen and ink, right? So I really like doing that. So that's what I wanted to do in the last few demonstrations, to show how you can essentially use different techniques to kind of focus on the different aspects of bark, and capture their the detail, their feel, essentially. So there we have it. So what I did was to just essentially use a bit of dark to ground the trunk as well. And over here, yeah, so you always should ground the trunk, like I've said before, and just adding a bit of dark, using a stroke, or using a grass stroke, something like this, grounds the trunk. Over here you can use a bit of flower, for example, just to add more interest. So that's always something that's really fun to do. So I can just, again, to add a flower, you draw a stem, draws a bit of dark at the top in the shape of a flower, and then you ground the stem, something like this. So I've covered this in detail in other demonstrations, so that's something you can do as well. So there we have it, right? And what I will do in the backdrop is to simply draw a kind of a small mountain, something like this. So I won't really shade the mountain, but I've again covered that in detail in other demonstrations. And what you should also do is to simply provide a bit of hint for the distance. So essentially, here, since we are much up close to the trunk, I can use a bigger size for the grass, something like this. But since this is far out, what I will do is to use a very small stroke for grass, to essentially show some kind of ground cover. So essentially, leaving it white, I don't like to leave the white, because that doesn't really give a sense of distance as such. And so yeah, somehow to me it looks a bit incomplete. So I always like to provide a bit of ground cover, even if it is just using the small dots or something like this, just to give a hint of distance. So what happens is now, because you have this grass bigger up close, and a bit of this small dots as a hint of ground cover, this also conveys the distance. So that's great. So what you always want to do is to essentially convey the distance as much as possible, and you always need to use the right size of that element to essentially convey it. So if I use a bigger grass, that will confuse the viewer, because they're expecting the grass that is far out in the distance to be smaller. So that's what you have to do. And once you use the right size, and because of perspective, our mind also senses the distance, and any landscape that has a distance in it is always more appealing, because the viewer can then travel the distance. So that's what I always like to do. So over here, we simply added a bit of grass, just to create a nice kind of distance in our drawing. So that's something like this. So there we have it. And at the end, if you want, you can always just provide a bit of shading for the mountain. So I won't cover this in detail, but in other demonstration I've shown how you can just simply use these parallel lines and add a bit of shading to create a nice form for a mountain that is at the backdrop. So mountain is a great way to create any kind of backdrop in your drawing, something like this. And there we have it. So this is how you can essentially create the bark texture for a tree. So just to recap, we started by drawing this kind of outline for our bark. So always use these kind of jagged edges, something like this, and you can use different shapes, but keep the bark sizes in the center the biggest. So here you can have feel for the biggest in the center, and towards the edges make it small. So that's what we did. And then finally we used the sticks and dots to essentially shade the bark pieces, but most importantly we also shaded one end darker than the other. So again, in this piece, for example, I will just go ahead and add a bit of ticks and dots to have an initial shading, but then I will go ahead and make one end darker than the other. So essentially, this kind of difference in tone, darker and lighter, brings out the roundness, the form for the bark piece, and also it also helps to differentiate between the different bark pieces. So here you can see, this bark piece is darker here, lighter here, and that serves to kind of differentiate between the different bark pieces we have, and gives a nice sense of, overall feel for the bark over here. So there we have it, yet another way in which you can draw, a bark detail and have a kind of, trunk up close, and yeah, a real simple fun drawing that you can do anytime and enjoy doing it. Thanks. Bye-bye.